purpose of this video is to give you some tips in preparing for the Victorian Performances exam. I'm not going to write or show you myself writing an exam answer, but I'm going to talk you through some of the elements that might go into an exam answer. The question I'm going to be looking at is one from last year's exam paper, although I'll be talking about two texts that you've studied in this last semester, Lady Audley's Secret and The Importance of Being Earnest. So what do we find when we look at the exam paper to begin with? The first thing we find is the rubric. This is a seen exam paper and I'm asked to prepare two questions. I'm just going to look at one in this video. I've got to discuss the work of at least two different texts. So I've chosen my two texts, Lady Audley's Secret and The Importance of Being Earnest. I choose my question. Now I'm not going to take you through all the questions on last year's exam paper. They're available on the KLE if you want to consult them, of course. But this is the one I've chosen. It's question 3. And it's a question you'll see. I'm not going to talk you through everything on all of these slides, but you'll see it's a question about issues of the domestic and domesticity. Discuss the presentation of the domestic or domesticity in two texts, study on the module. And as with lots of exam questions, I get a quotation as well that gives me some extra detail, various things that I might want to explore. I'll have a look at that question in more detail in a moment. The raw materials that I need to answer any exam question are always the same. I'm going to need a central argument, or what we sometimes call a thesis statement. That's something that I want to be able to set up quite neatly in the introduction, perhaps refer back to in the body of the essay that I'm writing, also refer back to in the conclusion as well. I want some sort of critical framework, i.e. some reference to secondary criticism or theory as well. Now I already know that I've been asked to prepare and find evidence from two primary texts, and I'm going to analyse that across a series of paragraphs in the essay. And at the end of all that, I want a conclusion. It's going to go some way to evaluate the preceding argument and the analysis. So I have my sense of what my structure roughly needs to be. I need an introduction, probably about 3 or 4 paragraphs of analysis. That's all I can fit into 50 minutes to an hour in an exam, followed by a conclusion. So if I return to the question and think about how this might help me to generate the argument. So there's two parts, as I said before. There's the quotation and then there's the direct question being asked. And the direct question is about domestic or domesticity. But it's a really interesting quotation that I've been given here. So I'll read it to you, and I've highlighted a few words here that I think I might want to explore. So I'm thinking about how I'm going to prepare an exam essay. These quotations can be quite useful just to give you little triggers, little starting points for thoughts of the kind of things you might explore in the essay. So surely a pretty woman never looks prettier than when making tea. The most feminine and most domestic of all occupations imparts a magic harmony to her every movement, a witchery to her every glance. So that's a description that Braddon gives us about Lucy Audley making tea. There are a variety of words that stand out here that seem to be important to the domestic. Feminine is one, so I'm going to be talking about gender, thinking about women particularly within the home, but that doesn't exclude men, and that's something that I might want to indicate in my introduction. That's something I might want to set up. We have the word domestic, of course, which I've highlighted there. Occupation is an interesting one for me. The idea of describing making tea as an occupation just suggests work, it suggests a job. It sets off a whole train of thoughts about why it might be called an occupation. But the idea that the domestic space is one of management and order, in which a woman's role is central in keeping that order through occupation, through work. So it's something that has to be worked at. Magic harmony. Well, harmony is something that is undoubtedly an issue in the Victorian depiction of the domestic space. A harmonious space is a good space, a space that represents the ideals of Victorian life in some way. But it's a magic harmony, so there's a suggestion here that there's something almost supernatural about it, and that's matched with the word witchery as well. There's also the sense that with the glance there, that the surface ritual of the tea taking perhaps doesn't match up or corroborate exactly what the thoughts are of the woman at this point who is making the tea. So they're my initial thoughts about the question. And from those thoughts, I've generated this introductory paragraph. Now you can stop these screencasts as we go along, so I'm not going to read out the whole thing here, but I'll just draw your attention to a few issues. The first is that I want to set up an argument that domestic life as described in that paragraph seems to suggest an ideal of harmony. It's almost magical, but that magical sense allows us to move into a feeling that underlying this depiction of domestic harmony, there might be some tensions bubbling away, and that's indicated by the witchery and also by the woman's glance. So I've said here that I think that the inner life of the woman, on which this image of the domestic ideal depends, seems to be less harmonious than the ritual of tea taking initially indicates, and that's the centre of my argument. And the final sentence I'll read out here. In this essay, I will explore the ways in which Braddon in Lady Audley's Secret and Oscar Wilde in The Importance of Being Earnest explore, through quite different literary modes, the notion that domestic harmony is an ideal, or even an illusion, on which social values are based, but which leads to duplicity, disorder, self-delusion, and even tragedy. And you'll see what I've done there. I've set up an argument. That's basically my statement of intent, my thesis statement. That's going to be my central argument, that domestic harmony is an ideal, but under the surface it's perhaps not quite as ideal as it first seems. It might even be described as an illusion. But I've added in a few extra details there: duplicity, disorder, self-delusion, even tragedy, thinking about the different ways in which the characters and the way they subscribe to these ideals of domestic harmony in the two texts I'm looking at might kind of pan out. So that's my introductory paragraph, and that sets up my argument. Paragraph 1, as I said before, I need some secondary material. I'm not going to talk through all of these things, but here's a list of secondary sources that I found that all address in some different way the Victorian domestic experience. That's apart from the first one by Michael McKeon, that's directed towards the 18th century. There are a variety of different ways of looking at the public and the private sphere. There are a few complex arguments going on in these books, but I've selected a few short quotations because in terms of quotations it's always difficult to remember long detailed passages, and often it's really not worthwhile memorizing long sentences. You really only need a few key elements. I'll look at one there, for example, Elizabeth Langley in Nobody's Angels. She uses the phrase that house as haven at one point. That's a memorable phrase that I can use to set up some critical material at the start of the essay. Coventry Patmore's famous poem, The Angel in the House, is one that you may have discussed in class briefly. Susan Johnston's phrase, rhetorical opposition of gendered spheres, suggests that the private world is a feminine world and the public world is a male world in Victorian fiction. That would be useful to me as well. All these things I can reference quite quickly in an exam essay and efficiently to produce what I've put there at the bottom of this slide, the overall framework, which is that while the domestic and the public realms are often considered as split, Victorian domestic life reflected the public successes and failures of a man as well as the state of his marriage. So that's my critical context. So I move into textual analysis. So the second paragraph, I'm going to address Lady Audley's Secret. I'm not going to talk you through again all of these ideas that I put down for that I could possibly include in this first paragraph, but you'll see there are several there, and there's a mix between sort of concept and analysis. I suggested that to begin with, a way of pitching Lady Audley's Secret in relation to this exam question is to think of bigamy. Bigamy, it's often overshadowed by that issue of madness in Lucy Audley, but the real crime here is a crime that is bigamy and it's a crime against domesticity. And I want to look at the sort of ideals of the Victorian home. Audley Court is in some ways an image of respectability, but under the surface it conceals secrets. I can analyse some texts some descriptions of Audley Court to emphasise that. Then I suggested there are several characters who are enthralled to this ideal of domestic bliss, and proposed that I might look at the two proposal scenes. The first was Sir Michael proposes to Lucy, and she performs the role of a helpless female. Well, that's a bit like the taking tea role. It's important that she performs that role, that she makes the man think that she's a helpless female who needs protection, because that upholds marriage and the domestic ideal. Or I could analyse the passage where Alicia rejects the proposal of Sir Harry Towers, and there's a great paragraph there where I don't need to remember it in detail, but Harry Towers bemoans the fact that he had a vision of Alicia with a parasol in the garden and two pointer dogs by his side. And it was a sort of parallel of Sir Michael and Lucy Audley and the ideal of domestic harmony in the Victorian period. I set that up in paragraph 2. In paragraph 3, I want to move the argument forward. How am I going to do this? Well, in this case, I want to underline that the angel of the house is a female role. It's a performance, but it's a performance used to uphold these ideals of Victorian standards of morality on which domestic life is based. The crime against domesticity, bigamy, means that Lucy's ejected from society at the end and ends up in the madhouse. Of course, I'm going to bring in the idea of occupation here with the tea-making quotation, and the idea that she needs that to preserve her social status. But I want to say in this paragraph as well that we see this from the male point of view primarily. In our encounters with Lucy, we're invited to see this from a female point of view and get the sense of understand why she wants to maintain this marriage to Sir Michael Audley. And it's because of her own status, in society. I come on to the importance of being earnest now. And to shift into this, I'm going to argue that the importance of being earnest is a parody of domestic harmony. But it shows just as well as Lady Audley's Secrets the importance that the fact that people collude in a deception, a sort of communal deception about social values that are represented by domestic life. So I might give some examples here of evidence to support this of the terrible marriages that are described. Lady Harbury, whose husband has recently died, whom Lady Bracknell tells us her hair has turned quite gold with grief. Other ideas that bachelors can be domesticated, or that men are only wild outside of marriage, can be tamed when within marriage. Algernon says, of course, to Cecily, I want you to reform me. That's part of this kind of almost sort of myth, I suppose, of the ideal of the domestic harmony in Victorian fiction. Occupation again comes in here, and the idea of it being mocked as a way of actually certifying character. If you're occupied, if the devil makes work for idle hands, that kind of thing, then you're going to be morally correct. Other ideas as well, the blue eyes that Gwendolen notes with Jack, that sense that this might corroborate the inner life, is something that matches up that quotation and the witchery of the glance in the woman preparing tea, that there's a hidden world, that even if the domestic world is well managed and well regulated, there's a hidden inner life that can't be witnessed, can't be viewed or policed properly. In paragraph 5 then, I thought I might refer back to the quotation again and look at the tea-making ritual with Gwendolen and Cecily. And there are a number of aspects here that show that Victorian domestic life is an ideal as much as a reality. The tea-making represents, again, a parody of domestic refinement that actually generates an argument between the two. But it's an argument because of domesticity, because they both want to get the husband they want. Gwendolen at one point says that the home seems to be a proper sphere for the man, but of course she's talking about her father here, and she doesn't want her father. She wants a wilder man, if you pardon the pun. And it seems there that in this section Wilde is writing about female desire, female emotion, and perhaps female sexual desire, anger, female manipulation and deception as well. Not unlike the deception, but in a very different context, in the context of humour, that Lucy Audley undertakes to uphold the domestic ideal. So Wilde and Braddon, as it were, are showing the lengths to which characters will go to uphold this domestic ideal, this ideal of domestic harmony that the tea-taking ritual represents. So that's my final piece of analysis for the importance of being earnest. And then I need my conclusion. Here my conclusion is that can the characters and the desires of characters, the inner life of characters, the witchery of the glance ever really be regulated by the domestic environment? Doesn't this just produce deception and deceit? Gwendolyn seems to underline this when she says that Mamma has brought me up to be extremely short-sighted. She also says at one point we live in an age of ideals. And one of these ideals, I want to say, is domestic bliss. The well-ordered domestic environment is not a guarantee of respectability, virtuous feelings, and moral worth in these texts. So that's my concluding paragraph and wrapping up the argument. So hopefully that's been of some use to you. As I said, it's not showing me writing the essay in full, but it's showing you the kind of elements that I would bring into each paragraph as I go along. And that may seem a little formulaic, but once you get into the details of those paragraphs, I think it's far from formulaic, and it's useful to have some sort of technical structure as a way of preparing for a scene exam in this manner. So that's my essay set out for you. Hopefully I do well.